for about 25 minutes or so about the importance of creating the study of anti-Semitism. So the importance of creating critical contemporary anti-Semitism studies. So basically, for those who don't know, you're part of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policies Summer Institute on Critical Anti-Semitism Studies. So basically, ISGAP was started in around 2003. We officially incorporated in 2005. And we started out, and I'm going to tell you my story, how I came to this very briefly. In the 1990s, I started reading about the Muslim Brotherhood. And I went to McGill University, the University of London, Oxford. I did a postdoc at the Université de Montréal in a center dealing with ethnicity and society, in a very nationalist university. And there was a blind spot. I was living in Jerusalem. I was teaching at Ben Gurion University, then later Tel Aviv University. And my area of specialization was looking at social theory and the perception of the other. How Western philosophy and social cultural policy perceived the other, constructed the other. And I looked at how this phenomenon was created from colonial times through to different policies to multiculturalism. And how basically European philosophy and political thought perceived the other and perceived themselves. And how this was manifested into policy. I also became very interested in the processes of globalization and how neoliberalism, which I'll get to in my lecture, and structural adjustment of the 1980s began a process in which the state was weakened, in a sense, because neoliberals, Thatcher, Reagan, the free marketeers thought that if the state had limited power, that more economic development would take place, that more capital would flow into developing countries in the third world, and that this would bring about economic development and more democratic principles. And what I was concerned about, and I worked on a book with my colleague Femi Vaughan, who will be here next Thursday. So Femi and I did a book on globalization and marginality. And what we were beginning to witness was that as this structural adjustment and neoliberalism was happening, there was more marginalization. And I was looking at sort of culture as a space of kind of protesting these changes, that culture became and identity became an important part of this changing socioeconomic and cultural process. And in 1997, I was part of an Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation group. My whole life, thanks to my grandparents and my parents, I've been very active on human rights issues. I don't want to bore you with details, but my grandfather, who was a refugee from Vienna, from Austria, lived in northern Quebec, and he owned a general store, as kind of the story of Jewish migrants. This is a common kind of occurrence. But he owned a store way north, about 500 miles north of Montreal in the Abitibi, in a place called Amos, a French town, colonized town. And he was the only Jewish person for 300 miles away with my grandmother, and one of the few English-speaking people. And the Iroquois, the indigenous people, he became very friendly with them. And they wanted to open up they had the best salmon in the world is in that part of the world, and my grandfather and his friend wanted to open up a fish cannery so the First Nations people, the Iroquois, can sell their fish. And to make a long story short, the Canadian government came to my grandfather and basically threatened him to be killed, that he had to stop. Because to empower the First Nations and the Indigenous people of Canada is a long story of oppression. So he was sort of active on these issues and a strong, active supporter of Israel and the Jewish community. So he was a speechwriter for Prime Minister John Diefenbaker in the 1960s, one of the first champions of human rights and international law that came out of Canada. The policy of multiculturalism came out of Canada. So he was in this environment. And my father's family was also very active in politics, socialist politics. So that, he was more conservative. The in-laws were socialists. There was lively table discussions. And I was very active in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, where basically students and housewives played a tremendous role in helping Soviet Jews to eventually be free to migrate and to live where they want. They were oppressed by the Soviet Union. So I was very active in that. And I was the president of Hillel, kind of active thanks to this sort of family background. And through these issues, I also became very active in the anti-apartheid movement. I was the chairperson of the ANC International Solidarity Committee. So I worked with the leadership of the ANC. So I was very active on Jewish human rights issues, international human rights issues, and local kind of Canadian human rights issues, and very close to the Innu people of Northern Labrador. I did a lot of work with them. There was a group of us that smuggled Ethiopian Jews to Canada before they were able to leave to Israel. It's a long story. The first 4 refugees, Jewish refugees, to come to Montreal, my family took in, so there's a sort of awareness. And basically a group of students smuggled these people in because Canada had an agreement with Sudan and Ethiopia that if you offer a scholarship to a student, there was an obligation to bring them to Canada. They would get a visa automatically, and these countries wanted to maintain good relations with Canada, so they would allow the students to go. And basically, my colleagues and I, this was before the internet and printers, we used to go around to our professor's office and basically have meetings with them and take some of their stationery, official McGill stationery when they weren't looking, and then we would offer scholarships to our brothers and sisters. That's how we got some people out. So I come from this background. Living in Israel, I was part of an Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation group. We used to meet once a month for dinners. And this was in the 90s where there was, I think, a very strong hope for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And we were part of a group of scholars that were trying to push for peace and for a two-state solution. And I remember I met a philosophy professor, a Palestinian philosophy professor, who was a very nice man, very cultured, very educated. And we would meet, and he would say the most bizarre things to my ears. He would say things about Jewish people that was horrific. He would say things about how women should not be out in public, that they had to be escorted and accompanied in public spaces by an adult male member of their family. He would be saying things about the civil rights movement in the United States and that were anti-democratic. And we would argue ferociously. But he was still a nice guy, but we would argue about these ideas. And then around the 3rd or 4th meeting, rather than fight with him, I said, can you recommend some books? Because I don't understand where you're coming from. And when you study politics, I did social theory and politics and philosophy. In a short period of time, when you meet somebody, you can usually figure out if they're right-wing or left-wing, religious, secular. You kind of, you get a sense of where they're coming from. And this guy, I had no idea where he was coming from. So he gave me books. And he gave me the books of the founding fathers of the Muslim Brotherhood, Qutb and al-Banai. And I started to read. And I was shocked for 2 reasons. One, I could not believe that the European anti-Semitism, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, Nazi ideology, the stuff that justified removing the Jewish people from society was not just a part of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, but was really a central core component. So learning about this, it was shocking that in the 1990s that this type of genocidal hatred was still not only existing, but was prevalent and growing in many countries in the world. And that I understood that this phenomenon, plus the neoliberal structural adjustments policies that were being imposed on the Middle East by the G7 countries, and the dislocation from the state by many, many citizens. There was more and more marginalization. I thought that this was, in a sense, the perfect storm. So I began to read anything I could put my hands on that was in English or French from the Muslim Brotherhood, and started getting very interested in this sort of the reemergence of anti-Semitism. I then moved to the United States, and as some of you know, Elie Wiesel and Kofi Annan had the first conference ever at the United Nations. The United Nations was built on the ashes of the Holocaust. The United Nations was created after the Holocaust. Europe and the world got together and said never again, and they created the United Nations on the ashes of the Holocaust. And for the first time in 2003, thanks to Kofi Annan and Elie Wiesel, they created a major international conference on the reemergence of anti-Semitism. And I attended with a group of scholars, and to make a long story short, there was concern. I think a few of us began to see the danger of the reemergence of anti-Semitism, and we created ISGAP. And ISGAP was just an informal group of professors and scholars. Elie Wiesel was our honorary president, which was a great honor. You know, I knew him a bit growing up. He had a sister who also survived the Holocaust that lived in Montreal. So he used to come to my family's synagogue a few times a year and give lectures. So I kind of grew up seeing him a couple of times a year. So he became our honorary president, which was a great honor. And we started to do seminars, and then we took our seminar series to Yale. In 2006, we opened the first, and this is amazing, given the legacy and the space or the place of anti-Semitism in Western civilization. In Western civilization, deep in Western civilization, in 2006, we opened the first ever research center at a North American or a Western Hemisphere university dealing with anti-Semitism, and it was called YISA, the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism. Some of my friends were scholars there. Professor Bassam Tibi, who will be speaking later, was a scholar with us there. We had seminar series, a graduate fellowship program, we had a postdoc fellowship program, and we had senior professors come to our center. And it was a highly successful project. And for 5 years we were there. And that experience, it's a long, drawn-out story, which I won't get into. I want to be brief, but I want to kind of give you the background of where we're coming from. So the first research center ever dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism. And you'll see there's something, and you'll see this in the lectures in the next 2 weeks, there's something non-threatening about dealing with dead Jews, dealing with murdered Jews. There's something not threatening about that. We're coming to terms with our past. The church is coming to terms with it slowly. European society is opening museums and erecting monuments and apologizing. So we're coming to terms. And this reminds me of David Theo Goldberg's book on racism, that the liberals' bigness, after the slavery, after the subjugation, after the genocide, the liberal bigness is when they apologize. They become big. So think about that. So what is the significance of these apologies? Particularly when, in Europe, once again, Jewish communities are under physical threat, and our people are moving out and leaving, and there's actually a sharp rise in violence against Jewish people. So dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism is problematic, and we had it at Yale. So we were dealing with political Islam, and political Islam on the radical left, there's the Red-Green Alliance. So even among liberal professors, there was this, it's problematic to be dealing with the study of anti-Semitism in spaces that were once colonized. Because to deal in spaces that were once colonized is somehow neo-imperialism or nationalism, or you're defending Israel. So we had liberal scholars. We had liberal Jewish scholars, many of whom were, I would say, terrified that we were there, because we posed a threat to their lives and to the equilibrium. So there's fear among Jewish intellectuals and Jewish scholars at universities in the United States. and certainly in Europe, to engage these issues. And students and scholars and even tenured professors know that if you engage this issue, you could pay a price with your career. You can not get tenured, not get promoted. We were at a conference last week where a PhD student, came to me with tears in his eyes, saying that he had to sign a BDS petition against ISGAP, because if he didn't, his supervisor, who was on his committee to have a PhD, would be upset and he would not get his PhD. So he signed the letter and came to me in tears, ashamed of himself, but he wanted his PhD. So we have the liberal intellectual problems, and then on campus in the United States, and I'll get into this in more detail, we have the Muslim Brotherhood. So there is the Muslim Student Association and the Students for Justice in Palestine, which are essentially fronts for the Muslim Brotherhood. So a anti-democratic, this is a social movement, a reactionary social movement that wants to destroy democracy, destroy democratic notions of citizenship. A Jew cannot be equal to a Muslim. A woman cannot be equal to a man. Gay people have to be destroyed. There's no space for them in society. And the rights of religious minorities are limited. And they are on campuses. They've been in campuses since the Muslim Brotherhood was in exile from Egypt. There was political refugees from Egypt. Many of them among them were the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And they went to universities. President Morsi came out of a university when he went to become the president of Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood. He was in California. So there's this strong connection of Muslim Brotherhood intellectuals at American universities, and the Muslim Student Association, the Students for Justice in Palestine, are fronts for the Muslim Brotherhood and funded by the Muslim Brotherhood on American campuses. There's hundreds of chapters throughout the United States. So they were also active at Yale, and they sought to undermine us. They called us racist and apartheid and colonialists. And the like. We had the largest conference. We had 600 people, 107 speakers came to Yale in 2010. It was the largest conference ever on anti-Semitism. And I remember sitting with my parents. They came to see the conference, and my mother turned to me and she said, "This is amazing. This professor is here and that policymaker's there. They're going to love you at Yale. You'll stay for the rest of your life." And I turned to my mother and I said, "You're watching the beginning of the end." Because we became too big. And this was 1 week before the conference. Yale, for the first time, agreed to match every dollar we raised. They were going to give us $1 of support. And the Muslim Brotherhood, literally, and the PLO, literally, and liberal scholars came together to shut down this vibrant, active research center. And it's the only time in the history of Yale that the academic review, every 5 years they review research centers at Yale, and they give a report how it can be improved. They've never closed down a center. They close down centers that are dormant. So the year before, they closed down a center on racism, because no professor, no students, no activities took place there for over 20 years. So they decided to close it. We were a vibrant center. So for the first time ever, the Academic Review Committee's report was deemed classified. So we were closed. Then Yale moved to New York, and we then figured we're going to take an international approach to the study of anti-Semitism, and we started doing seminars all over the world at high caliber research centers. So we had a seminar series at Harvard, Columbia, Fordham, Stanford University, University of Miami. We did a seminar series 1 year in Kiev. We have one of our colleagues from Kiev who's here, who helped us organize it. We did a program at Le Sorbonne. And at Le Sorbonne, just to give you a sense of where Europe is these days, our seminar series at Le Sorbonne was eventually stopped. Why? Because of security. So in our seminar series at Le Sorbonne, we had 2 plainclothes police officers from the state, from the federal state, in our classroom, armed, and we had 2 soldiers outside our classroom, armed, because of how controversial the study of contemporary anti-Semitism was a few years ago and remains to this day. So we continue to do seminars. We have a small research center at La Sapienza University in Rome, which is run by Robert Hassan, who's our colleague at ISGAP. And we do research projects. We're doing several projects now. We're trying to develop a new way to measure anti-Semitism using algorithms and science and trying to understand how to measure it in social media. In the old days, if somebody painted a swastika in a bathroom or on a wall, it was counted as an anti-Semitic incident. But now, as the discourse is shifting, as political leaders are changing the dialogue, the public dialogue, how do you measure these types of anti-Semitism? How do you measure the shifting forms of anti-Semitism, which is alive and well in the European and British political discourse, and now in the United States of America with the extreme right and the extreme left, and now even those who are connected to the Muslim Brotherhood directly in Congress, speaking the tropes, the genocidal tropes of anti-Semitism that is now being, in the sort of world of social media and information, becoming part of the public conversation. And Linda Sassor, as you know, sent out this tweet yesterday. So all these people changing the political discourse, how do you measure it? And we're also doing a project, it's called Follow the Money. And some people say, this is not academic scholarship. I profoundly disagree. Some people say this is what security forces should do. So we're following the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam in the university, how Qatar and other countries from the Gulf and even American companies that are domestic in the United States, major corporations and banks, are funding, we call soft jihad, in American universities and changing the discourse, changing the curriculum, changing the perception of Israel, of Zionism, and of Jews. And in a sense, and you'll hear this from scholars from Bassam Tibi and David Patterson and others during the week, that political Islam is not only took the most pernicious forms of European anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism was a European phenomenon that has been exported to the Middle East, but how they cannot accept the self-determination or the equality of the Jew to a Muslim. And Israel is the only state of others, of non-Muslims in that region. So it's not a question of the borders or where Israel, the map should be drawn. Even if Israel was just the city of Tel Aviv, and in Tel Aviv, Jews were equal to Muslims, and men were equal to women, and gay people had the right to vote. This would be unacceptable from a political Islamist perspective, because a Muslim has to be higher, and other religious groups can be protected minorities that pay special taxes. They're called dhimmis. And that would be, so in a sense, the democratic state of Israel, with all its contradictions and issues and problems, cannot be accepted from the worldview of political Islam. And I would say that we in the West, that scholars in the West, students in the West, we need to respect our enemies. The Muslim Brotherhood studied in American and Western universities. They know our culture, they know our language, they know our political system, they know who we are. And we are not fluent. I went to McGill, London, Oxford, University of Montreal. I kind of heard about the Muslim Brotherhood. I didn't read one page of one book in political science about them ever. I had to learn this by myself on my own. So we need to learn, with respect, the mind of our enemies. What do they think? What's their philosophy? What's their religion? What's their political mission? What are their military missions? How do they perceive justice, women, gay people, Jews, democracy, citizenship? What do they want? And do we think so arrogantly That if we're nice, they're going to be nice to us. If we're tough, they're going to be tough with us. Right? We have to understand the other, for better or for worse.
This is not arrogance, this is naivete.
Not arrogance, naivete. There's a Chinese proverb that says you cannot wake up a dog pretending to sleep. But here you go. So I think that we have to really, if we care about democracy, if we care about human rights, if we claim to be truly liberal, if we claim to be, as scholars and students, searching for truth and learning, this is a phenomenon that is of great importance, not just to the Jews, and not just to the Israelis. I think, in fact, the Israelis are strong, and they can protect themselves. And they understand the neighborhood, and they understand the region, and they understand what's taking place at a deep level in the communities and societies around them. But the challenge for us is to understand what Elie Wiesel taught us. And I think if you could remember this, and I'll repeat it, it's going to be repeated throughout the 12 days. Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, Nobel Peace Prize winner, always taught us that anti-Semitism always begins with the Jews. Always. It always begins with the Jews, but it never, ever, ever ends with the Jews. Ever. And once you allow this form of hatred to go unleashed upon society, it knows no boundaries. And liberals in the West, at Yale, at the Ivy Leagues, in the media of record, in the New York Times, in the Guardian, in Le Monde, in Oxford, in the Sorbonne, where education is produced and disseminated into the global system of education, where Edward Said speaks at Columbia and Oxford, and everybody eventually learns to read him. That we have been silent as a people in the face of this anti-Semitism. So we excuse it because we say we're not opposed to the Jews, we're not opposed to the Jewish people, but we're opposed to Zionism. So we look at the Zionists, we look at the Israelis, we look at the Jewish Zionists, and they have been demonized and dehumanized and delegitimized for decades. And in the name of progressive intellectuals, it becomes acceptable. So the world focuses on the Jew. The world is focusing on the Zionist. But over here, we have the Muslim Brotherhood growing. Over here, mosques have been slowly taken over by radicals throughout the Middle East. Over here, countries have fallen under the power of the Muslim Brotherhood. Women have been subjugated. Girls are no longer able to teach, to study, to read. They can't go to get an education because their space is not there. Their place is not there. Societies have collapsed. Iran is spreading genocidal European anti-Semitism, Nazi-inspired anti-Semitism through the world. And they've been getting a pass for decades. There is a genocide taking place in Syria, in Iraq. 1 million Syrians murdered. Bassam Tibi's family is from Syria, he'll tell you about it. In real time, over the last 8 years, in the time of social media and the internet, a genocide has slowly been taking place. But do we read about the 1 million people murdered by Islamists, Shiite and Sunni Islamists, who have their roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, who have their roots in Nazism? Do we read about the 15 million refugees? Are we able to say when a terrorist attack happens, it's by an Islamist? A genocidal anti-Semitic Islamist? For many years, progressive liberals would say, no, you can't say that. But criticize the Jews, criticize Israel, focus on Israel, the only democracy in that entire part of the world, with all of its problems and all of its contradictions. Not only was that acceptable, not only is it acceptable, if you want to have a good career in academia, if you want to have a good career in the top journals and newspapers in the world, you have to espouse that. that is incumbent upon you to adopt this dominant ideology to focus on Israel. But look at what's happening in the world. Genocide, massive migration, refugee crisis. And now when the liberals and the intellectuals and the human rights community has been completely silent on this. And if you spoke on it, you were racist. If you spoke on it, you were a Zionist. If you spoke on it, you were an Islamophobe. If you spoke on it, you were a colonialist and apartheid supporter. But now we have a refugee crisis, and now we see Brexit. And now we see the rise of right-wing extremism that are a reaction to the silence, I would argue, of those who should have been protecting democratic principles and human rights. But we have been blinded once again by pure, unadulterated anti-Semitism. So as Elie Wiesel says, this is not just about the Jews. This is not about the Zionists. This is about a profound attack on who we are as human beings, And those of us who believe in democratic societies, the rule of law, and that all people need to be equal under this one legal system, not subjugated and segregated. I was born Jewish. I'm Jewish because my mother is Jewish. That's the only reason I'm Jewish. Because my mother is Jewish, I was born Jewish. But in societies, in democracies, at universities, we always have to struggle. We don't inherit our democracy. We always have to protect it and expand it. And those of us in the academy have a profound responsibility to protect it and to ensure it and to expand it. Because we get to sit around and discuss ideas. Most people are working 2 jobs, 1 job, 3 jobs, trying to make ends meet. And we get to sit around and write papers and have discussions and argue over coffee and beer and lunch about ideas. So it's a privileged existence. It's really a privileged existence. And you know, in the Jewish tradition, a teacher, a scholar, has a moral obligation, students have a moral obligation to have responsibility to your community because of our privileged position. And never for 2 pieces of silver do we sell out this sacred responsibility. And it's a struggle. And I think there are people in this room that literally struggle, who've given up tenure, who've given up job security, who get battered at conferences. I was just with Gabe Braun last week at a conference. And the reaction he got in Israel at an international conference is just, it's astounding. Yeah. It was a beautiful moment at some level. But, so I hope that if this gathering is successful, we will learn about the issues, we'll exchange, we'll debate, we'll have arguments about ideas, never personal, never attack the person, but to argue about ideas is a beautiful, wonderful thing. And we should be free to do that. But we are living in a moment where there's a possibility. Imagine, the United Kingdom in the next 6 months, there is the possibility, I hope it won't happen, but there is a possibility, a significant possibility, that an overt, open, doubling down anti-Semite will be elected as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And if this happens, ladies and gentlemen, it will not just affect the UK. It will affect Europe. It will affect the discourse in the United States. It will have global ramifications. And some in the Red-Green Alliance, Corbyn, imagine, Corbyn was paid. He was paid by the Iranian revolutionary regime to do a TV show. He was on their payroll. So here is a progressive, socialist, liberal in the UK and secular UK being paid by the Iranian revolutionary regime that traces its ideology to the Muslim Brotherhood, who calls for the extermination as a core element of their ideology, of their political mission, of their military mission. And this leader of the Labour Party continues in this anti-Semitic discourse. So how can a socialist, secular, British political leader from the left be allowed to have this background? It's astounding. So we are living in a time where we can never underestimate our power as a group, and we need to learn and we need to understand, and these are things that are changing rapidly. You know, things are changing rapidly. So this is what's at stake. And I think this is the work that ISGAP does, basically. And we're trying to continue to build. We have Ansel Brown, I think he'll come here later, I don't see him. Carlton, Olufemi Vaughn, who's with us, Katya. There's a group of us, and I hope the group will expand. We're creating this program on homeland and diaspora studies. I mentioned it earlier. How, when Africa and Israel is debased, how does it affect people in the diaspora? What are the implications in terms of racism? If Africa is perceived as, I don't want to repeat the famous words of the President of the United States, but if people think of Africa in that sense, how do they perceive African American citizens of the United States? If Zionism is an apartheid, racist, colonial entity, a fascist entity, a pinkwashing entity, then what do you perceive? How do you perceive Jewish people going to pray on Sabbath? How do you perceive Jewish students on campus going to a Hillel or a Jewish student organization if they support the fascist apartheid regime in this liberal postmodern space? How are they impacted? So, and study after study, Barry Cosman is going to be teaching later this afternoon. He did a very important study showing how young Jewish students in the United States are experiencing anti-Semitism at a much higher rate than any other minority in the United States, double and triple other levels of racism and sexism in the United States and in the UK. So things are changing rapidly, and we as students and scholars need to come to terms with the changing reality and to find ways to teach it and to take a stand against it, because as we saw last week at a conference in Oxford, the conference stopped because there were several people from ISGAP who are incredibly accomplished, leading scholars, PhDs from the best universities, tenured positions from some of the top universities in the world. And the conference came to a complete stop because the white settlers were there, even though 5 of the people are of African origin. The colonialists were there. The Zionists paid the organizers of the conference to somehow invite themselves there. They were giving secret money to this department. That, I hate to say this, but I will repeat it. In public, at a conference on racism, my colleagues were referred to as the ISGAP Negroes. That's shocking. But this is the level of anti-Semitism. That people in a public, serious university like Oxford University have the audacity to openly and confidently and proudly insult Jewish people and people of African origin, and to insult scholars whose ideas are different than theirs, but have all of the credentials to present a paper, and it's about ideas. We're supposed to present our papers. We're supposed to present our papers and get critiqued by our colleagues. Sure.
But the people who were demonizing, dehumanizing ISGAP and those who were supporting ISGAP, they weren't British, or they weren't from American university, they were American predominantly. If not all of them were American.
That-
came to
yeah.
a foreign country to, in a sovereign institution to do that.
So that's true. And as a footnote, Lily said that the people who were protesting the presence of people dealing with the ISGAP scholars who were dealing with issues of Pan-Africanism and Zionism and the connections between racism and anti-Semitism, the deep commonalities, spiritual, religious, historical between Africans and Jews and African Americans or diaspora Africans. The people who stopped the conference were mostly, if not all actually, from the United States. All of them were. And actually Lily was... Pardon? Yeah, exactly. So,
Mostly it was started by, I think, a Caribbean, from the Caribbean.
from Syracuse.
Syracuse.
Yeah.
And then the group, a clique from UCLA, African Americans, sort of jumped on. And then there were other,
And just as a footnote, this Lily was the only person at that conference who had the courage and the integrity to stand up and try to stop the insanity. She was very brave, actually, because in that space it was very difficult. It's hard to imagine, but it was very difficult to stand up. So Lily was amazing. So this is now very much a part of the American political campus. It's part of the classroom, and it's deeply troubling. So we need to, I think, unpack this and try to understand what are the forces behind this and why is it happening and who's supporting it and what are we supposed to do with this. So this is the introduction to the work of ISGAP. I'll just say very quickly, our headquarters is in New York. It's being run, our office is run by Ira Guberman, who you know. We have we're a charitable organization in Canada. We have a group of people in Toronto. We have Robert Hassan at La Sapienza University in Rome. We have Mala Tabori, who's a professor of law, and she's the director of ISGAP Canada. Of ISGAP Israel, so we have an entity there. And we're a small group dealing with these issues. We do a lot of policy advice to governments on these issues. And the good thing is governments, particularly in Europe in the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years, are really beginning to listen to us. We've been doing this for a long time, and I'd say in the last few years, people are receptive. We were doing a lot of work on interfaith, I wouldn't say dialogue, but trying to bring Muslims and Christians and Jews together. We work in conjunction with the Vatican, and I don't want to sound egotistical, but something beautiful happened in November. I was the first Jewish person. I'm also Israeli. I have an Israeli passport. So I was the first Israeli and Jewish person to address the Muslim World League. And the Muslim World League is the most important Sunni organization in the world. It's run by a man named Dr. Muhammad Al-Isa. And I was the keynote speaker with Dr. Muhammad Al-Isa, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, the Secretary General of the the Organization of Islamic Countries, and other top Sunni leaders. The Muslim World League, I believe, is trying to change, but about 2 years ago, the Muslim World League was the address for propagating anti-Semitism and even terrorism around the world. It was led by the Muslim Brotherhood's leader, Yosef Kawadawi. Now, Yosef Kawadawi, I'll end it here so Carlton can come up. But Yosef Kawadawi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, who you'll hear about during the next 2 weeks, he famously says that true believers need to complete the work of Hitler. True believers need to finish the work of Hitler. The person who was instrumental in creating the Oxford Islamic Studies Center here, down the road, was none other than Yosef Kawadawi. So the way the Brotherhood has infiltrated the best universities in Europe, and certainly many, many universities in the United States, is astounding. That we invite the money of people who openly call for the extermination of Jews. Imagine. And this is a university. So either a university is a space for ideas with integrity, or it becomes a cheap business that we sell to the highest bidder. But imagine people who openly call for the extermination of a group of people and the subjugation of many other groups of people have been playing an instrumental role in funding universities around the world in the tune of billions of dollars. This is part of our research. So I'm going to end it there. I'm going to introduce Heather Mann. She wasn't here yesterday, but Heather will also be helpful. She'll be around most of the program, and she will be a great resource to the Wiesel King scholars. And Heather is studying education and Holocaust studies here at Oxford University, and she's an amazing scholar in person, and she's a wonderful asset to you, very knowledgeable about Oxford and the issues that we're dealing with. So we're honored that Heather is with us, and please feel free to engage her in conversation. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Carlton to deal with pedagogy. Grazie. He doesn't need a mic.
Yeah.
You can talk now. Nice to
I was going to hear you reading the whole time.
Should I not get near that microphone?
No, that's fine. You can use both. Yeah. So just use that for the audience and use this for the camera. This is just feeding back to the camera.
Okay, no problem.
Don't worry about it. It's like it's not there. Okay.
Perfect. Now just put some water. Just in front of you.
Perfect. How's it sound to you? Does that sound good? Right, he's just getting a drink and then he's going to charge it.
Thanks, Charles. Son, said my mother when I was knee-high, you've need of clothes to cover you, but not a rag have I. There's nothing in the house but a loaf end of rye and a harp with a woman's head that no one will buy. And she began to cry. That was in the early fall. When came the late fall, son, she said, the sight of you makes your mother's blood crawl. Little skinny shoulder blades sticking through your clothes, and where you'll get a jacket from, God above knows. It's lucky for me, lad, that your dad is in the ground and can't see the way I let his son go around. And she made a queer sound. That was in the late fall, and when the winter came, I not a pair of breeches nor a coat to my name. I couldn't go to school or out of doors to play, and all the other little boys passed our way. Son, said my mother, come climb into my lap, and I'll chafe your little bones while you take a nap. And oh, but we were silly for half an hour more, me with my long legs dragging on the floor. A rocking to a Mother Goose rhyme. Oh, but we were happy for half an hour's time. Men say that was in the late fall, and when the winter came, I not a pair of breeches or a coat to my name. A wind with a wolf's head howled about our door, and we burnt up the chairs and we sat upon the floor. All that was left was a chair we couldn't break and the harp with a woman's head that no one would take for song or pity's sake. Men say the winter was bad that year. Fuel was scarce and food was dear. So that is just a sample of the way that I sometimes attempted to engage students when I came to a classroom. Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem, Ballad of a Harp Weaver. And in that she, of course, talks about a very dear relationship between mother and son. And she talks about poverty. And I suppose in some ways the poem resonated with me, because even though I ended up a middle-class kid, and a kid who went off to the Ivy League and also to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, I started off in poverty. And I was a charter member of the Head Start program. I was in the first year in Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty program. I remember coming home very excitedly with my little book tucked under my arms and reading and reading and reading with my mother in a situation which was not unlike the situation which is painted for us in the Ballad of a Harp Weaver. So, as I often tell students of mine, we tend to come to research projects not by accident and not by alphabetical order. When I was at Oxford, I studied affirmative action, but it wasn't because that was the first thing I saw in the dictionary. I studied because it had deep meaning for me. So I engaged in comparative study. Charles and I were friends and attending the same seminars. And I was looking critically into issues of the idea of race, the social construction of race, the fabrication of race, and the implications of it in policy terms, in terms of education especially. So even though I was doing doctoral work, doing a cross-cultural analysis, looking at what is called affirmative action policy in the United States and what is sometimes called positive action in Britain when people like it, and called positive discrimination in Britain when people don't, the core of my work was always in education. So I've been really very fortunate, so I'm particularly delighted to be the director of pedagogy for ISGAP. And I say that because my range, I've been very blessed in terms of the range of my instruction. I've spoken with parents several times, and I said, well, they asked me about my background in education. Well, what classes have I taught? What levels have I taught? And I can proudly say, well, my instruction spans pre-K to PhD. And I say that with a great deal of pride and humility, because I learned so many different things by engaging in instruction at so many different levels. And just as a short example, and I will speak to you as colleagues who mostly teach, as I was fortunate to do at the university level. My university level instruction experience is wildly different from my research and instruction and boots on the ground level with people like Maxine and others when I was working in the K-12 system. And I think that there may be something that we can learn from one another. For instance, when I was offered my position at Columbia, I was basically asked to consider my research areas of race, American government, politics, sociology, international affairs, and to craft courses around those. So I taught American government politics, the politics of affirmative action. I created a course on the politics of censorship, and I taught contemporary Western civilizations, which is really kind of a political theory course, and the students at Columbia jokingly referred to it as from Plato to NATO. But you know, the interesting thing though is when I was offered the opportunity to teach that course, I was fresh out of Oxford to teach those courses. And I had brilliant colleagues on my faculty, including Charles V. Hamilton, who wrote Black Power, and many others. And the chair of the department gave me no professional development. The professor said, hey, go teach this. Which courses do you want to teach? We need you to teach this, we'd like you to teach that, you have a choice of teaching this, and then you can create a couple of courses. So just give us your syllabi when you're done. No one said this is Vygotsky, no one said this is Piaget, no one said this is Auguste Mann, or this is Reuben Forrestine, or this is Dewey. I had no explicit theoretical framework for what I did, except for what was in my head and my heart. And so what was in my head and heart was very much a love of the humanities. I had studied language. I studied Spanish and French and a little bit of Russian. I loved literature. I've been a poet all my life. I come from a family of poets. And so when I first started teaching at Columbia, I started with what I loved. So it's very common for me to open the class with the recitation of a poem. And it got to be so well known in the university, and the students so, I think, enjoyed it, that they used to say, oh, here comes one of Professor Long's poetry moments. So I mentioned that to say that it really in some ways connects to the work that we attempt to do at ISGAP. The work is deeply from you, from your head and your heart, and we encourage it to be interdisciplinary. So I think that one of the wonderful things I'd like to ask you to begin to think about, those of you who are currently university instructors and who will be returning to your university context in order to implement courses, I think I'd like to ask you to contemplate what is your area of interest, what is your area of expertise, and how might that connect to some of the themes of our 12 days together here. And as a result of that, what new thing might you create? What new syllabus might you create that can be delivered in your context? And this is wholly your own thing. As I said earlier yesterday, I'm here, my expertise is to facilitate your expertise. So my goal really is very much to ask you to begin to think, to reflect now, maybe keep a private journal and ask yourself, well, if I'm going to implement a course, when I return to my context, what might that new course be given the thoughts that have been ignited here? Given the reflections that I have, the concerns, the problematica that I'm engaging with here. And make that own thing yours. And we'll have a chance next week to meet in fellowship and to engage and to take a look at what you're developing. And then I will be here as a resource to help to think about different approaches to pedagogy that they didn't tell me about when I was a university instructor. I had to learn some of these things when I was doing professional development, when Maxine introduced me to Kane and Kane Making Connections about the brain, when other people from another group introduced me to Eric Jensen, Thinking with the Brain in Mind, and a host of other wonderful resources. So I'd like to share some of these with you when we meet, and also more than that, to hear from you in terms of the syllabi which you are beginning to create. Those who are moving into a different context, not everybody is involved in university instruction, then I'd like to ask you to think about what might be a project or something that you might do. What follow-up implementation might you do which might carry forward some of the thinking and exchanges and the debate and the argumentation and the reflection and the lingering questions that may exist as a result of the time that we have here together. I also, of course, am very mindful of the Wiesel King scholars since I came to Charleston years ago and said we should have Wiesel King scholars. So Wiesel King scholars, will you please stand? This is amazing. I mean, when we first started, we had 2 or 3 students. And now we have undergraduate and graduate students who I promise you, I'm constantly floored by your comments. I heard a couple of undergraduates speaking yesterday. I said, they're undergraduates. This is amazing. So please have a seat. We're expecting you to think about your project. What will be your project when you return to? How can you carry forward your learnings, your discoveries from our time together? And we'll have a little breakout time to expect emails from me. And say, look, we're going to have a little bit of an orientation. And also for the Wiesel King Fellows, Dr. Rakesha Fry-Brown, soon to be Dr. Heather Mann, will you please to stand? They'll be helping to facilitate those conversations with us. And so I'd like just to share with you, just as a way of beginning, I'd like to make bridges between the work. Because one of the things that I found helpful, one thing that they do very well at the K-12 level, and especially K-6, is that they prime students. They don't just come in and say, hey, there's a lecture. I mean, you could say, you make arguments at the university level that we prime you by giving you a syllabus, saying this is what's coming up. But instruction at the lower levels is really quite beautiful. So if a teacher is going to teach about Little Red Riding Hood, the teacher might start off and ask students, what are some of your favorite colors? Yellow, green, red. Oh, red, that's an interesting thing. We're going to talk about red today, right? How many have ever been afraid? Oh, I've been afraid. What have you been afraid of? Oh, I'm afraid of the boogeyman. Oh, okay. Well, we're going to talk about somebody who's wearing red who gets afraid. Are you ready? Yes. And so they begin. They prepare the mind for the instruction. At the university level, and I'm guilty of, perhaps more guilty of this than anyone, as we prepare them, I prepare the mind for instruction by saying, you'll get an A in my class, you do these things, you get an F if you don't. And Dr. Raymond will tell you a funny story. I think he might remember. I was the only person who managed to not take his midterm exam. There was a trick to it. I'll tell you about it later. It had to do with his morality. Well, I'll just tell you, he had passed out an old syllabus, and it said, you can either write a paper, my strength, I love writing. You can either write a paper or you can take my midterm exam. And his secretary had made the mistake because that was last year's syllabus. Here I was in intro poli-sci with him at DePauw. And so he came out, great ethics, and said, students, I want you to know that I gave you the syllabus, and it said in it that you could either write a paper or you could sit the midterm exam. That was a mistake. My secretary passed that on, but because you have been in possession of this syllabus for a day, I will honor that if any of you think that you would prefer to write a paper and that you've made that decision. Now, having read the syllabus, I went to Dr. Raymond and said, I really did see that. And I really, I was planning to write a paper. So he later asked one of the directors of the student government, who is this Carlton Lawn guy? He's the only person I know who's ever gotten out of my midterm exam. So there we have it. So that says something to us also about honoring our word as educators. So preparing the mind for the instruction is important. The poem that I share with you was quite deliberately about the love between a mother and child. And I wanted very much, in some ways, to prepare us to return to our conversation yesterday when there was a great concern about a mother and child. And that was, of course, the story, 24 Days with Ilan Halimi, the Ilan Halimi affair. So I'm going to ask you just to take a quick stroll down memory lane. And then we'll have a little bit of reflection on that. Bear with me 1 second. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you if you can just have a sidebar with the person next to you about your own approach to pedagogy. That is, those of you who are educators, what has worked for you in terms of your own pedagogy? I share with you a little bit about my own. I would tap into my strength in terms of poetry. And for those of you who are students, what has worked for you in the classroom? So if you're talking with another student, what has worked for you in the classroom? And if you're an instructor or an educator, what do you think works, or what has been your own personal approach to pedagogy while I was trying to get us reconnected here? Excuse me 1 second. Ira, I need help I need your help quickly at the podium because I have to get this video up and running. It's time
Do the
sensitive.
Wi-Fi, or?
Yeah, the Wi-Fi. It just seems to have timed out.
Was it going, or was it going at all?
It was going, but then it timed out. I just want to get to a YouTube of the Ilan Halimi affair. It was up.
You didn't put a coding yourself, though, did you?
What's that?
You didn't put a coding yourself, did you?
No. It was actually working.
Yeah, I think I connected earlier. Just
Yeah.
phased out. We'll try it.
Okay. Okay, good. I want to go to YouTube. Okay, yeah, I think so, but don't go too far because I want to make sure the. Okay, don't go far. Can you just stand over here because I'm going to need you just for 5 minutes, okay? Is it okay? All right, great. Thank you. All right, let's come back together. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, group. We're all coming back together. Thank you. Thank you, group. Thank you. What I just did, just to have a metacognitive moment, what I just did there was a classroom strategy. It is called Thank Them to Death. Just thank you, we're coming together, thank you. And they're like, okay, oh, he's being so nice, let's get together. But actually, it's actually a way of calling everyone to, there's theory behind this, to group process. And group process is very different. I learned this in Maxine's company. The group process is very different from be quiet. Group process is an appeal to the group, and it's quite democratic in the classroom. It's saying, may we have certain agreements, and can one of those agreements be that we all come together at the same time to attend to the same event, whether it's one speaker, many speakers, a group. So the appeal to group process is something that can work very well in the classroom. It works brilliantly in K-12 instruction. I suspect it could work at the university level as well. Can we have a couple of people just share out briefly from your you did kind of a pair share, right? Can anybody tell us something that you either heard or that you said that you might think might be edifying to the group? Yeah, Jessica?
Hello, everyone. So for me, I think the biggest thing as a student is to connect with my professors on a more personal level. I think that oftentimes students forget that teachers on every level are actual people. And so it's really important to make that connection throughout the process of your education, because then it's easier to learn from somebody that you know beyond just seeing them in the classroom, because you can understand their perspective, you can understand, just what they do on a day-to-day basis and stuff like that. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, just tell me your name. Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
So
uh-huh.
my partner and I were talking. He told me how he's a professor for political science in a university in the United States, and he said something very interesting that I never thought about. And where when he goes into class, he actually prepares a draft for his syllabus, and then he gives it to the students to comment on, and then he takes back their comments and adjusts the syllabus according to what they would think. And just considering the comments and the commentaries, and that's very interesting.
did kind of, and he does it very eloquent way with what I did rather clumsily when I was Dr. Grant's student. Yeah. Yes, please.
One of the things that I use and do a lot of is humor. Some of the best ways I find to deal with controversial issues are sometimes you just have to use a meme, right? You have to go on Twitter and be like, this is what's going on Twitter. Like I think about colorism, I use a lot of memes talking about colorism, one that looks like a 90s or 80s graphic that says the caucasity. And it's really successful to connect with students. Some of you are laughing because I know you've seen the caucasity. But it's a way to connect with students about a very serious topic on a very human level, right? Like a context zone level.
Thank you, Dr. J.
Sure. One of the things that was unexpected, but I guess I'll attribute it to an hour and a half of sleep after laughing at living off campus, was that I answered the question in two ways. I answered it with how I teach when I care and how I teach when I do not. And as a grad student or as a PhD from Case Western Reserve, I teach when I care based on experiential learning theory. I start with concrete experience and get them into the room with their experiences or provide a common stimuli like this trailer. Then I just have them in small groups do reflective observation and discuss things, and then I bring the theory in to apply it to what they've said. Then we talk about future actions. And so when I care, that is how I teach. When I do not care, I go straight to theory of life.
Thank you. A couple more. Yes, please.
It's connected to what Chappelle was saying, that I really appreciate when my professors in the past have been very flexible about where the material goes in the conversation with their students. They're not too controlling. They acknowledge that the whole process of discussion is about transforming that knowledge. And it shows, I think it shows a lot of confidence on the part of the professor to be able to let students in part decide what is relevant and decide how that knowledge connects to them.
Thank you. Our Emmy Award-winning journalist, Shannon.
Well, to that point about professors being flexible in how they instruct their students, I was speaking with my seatmate who was also my roommate at our pod over there, Jim here, he's a professor at Clayton, and he just told me something that I hadn't really thought a lot about, how he is a very old school professor. Lectures have served him well. They've served all of us well for many years, but he's learning that more students are receiving information more from storytellers. And so how he's had to struggle a bit, maybe adjust his style a little bit to storytelling more than just lecturing. And I thought that was, as a storyteller, I thought that was very interesting.
Thank you. And one last one. Yes, please.
I think the theme that's come up is that you're talking about dialoguing with your students, and some things that I do is going back to your circumstance, your first year at DePaul. I teach at liberal arts college, so I have the opportunity to give my students a choice, paper or exam. And I don't treat them as an end game. If they do poorly on a paper or on an exam, they can turn around and write me an 8-page paper, and I'll average the grade. Right? I'll keep averaging that grade until they get their A. And they learn a lot that way. And I also dialogue with the students, which people are saying. So when I'm going to ask an exam or paper question, we'll come up with that together. And it elevates their work dramatically, as opposed to them trying to decipher what I said. So I just wanted to add that to the wonderful comments already.
Thank you. Now, there are some scholars who have wrapped theory around a lot of times we know the right things to do, and I think that's the idea of the natural teacher, right? But then it's also very convenient when we find theoreticians who wrap theory around what we already know works, or provide us with theory which support what we would like to do or what we might like to experiment with. For instance, Carol Tomlinson talks a great deal about differentiation. We do that in K-12 instruction a great deal. That is, we try we work with the idea that we want to meet students at their own level and to push them. The Oxford tutorial system does that in a way. Your DON, your tutorial pushes you, but not further than you can go, but pushes you based on where you are. So there are many things we can continue to unpack theoretically and also experientially in our time together. And I'm just very, very happy that we're having a chance to open up that conversation. And I would encourage us to sustain that conversation, to grow it over the next 12 or so days. So thank you for your feedback with regard to that. So I'd like to just go to this clip for a second. Oh, can we get the lights? We might have to get the lights for that. Give me more volume. Yeah, and give more volume if you can. Do we got the...
Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé exactement?
J'étais là, il m'a appelé, il m'a demandé de regarder la fille qui sortait de sa boutique là, de l'autre côté du boulevard.
C'est elle qui a entraîné votre fils. Qu'est-ce qui nous arrive?
Le 20 janvier, à 21h53, Ilan reçoit un coup de fil de la part. Et après, on n'a plus aucun signal.
Qui aurait pu croire qu'une chose pareille pouvait arriver à Paris en 2006? Et pourtant, tout est vrai. Bien trop vrai.
Allô? On veut 450 et on les veut tout de suite.
L'appel vient d'Afrique.
C'est quoi ce bordel? Je veux pas là, Ilan.
C'est moi qui dis ce qu'on fait!
Il faut trouver l'argent, c'est un fou. Il faut pas tomber dans ce piège-là. C'est seulement pour faire peur.
On peut pas juste leur donner ce qu'ils demandent.
Non, madame, en France, on ne paye pas. C'est un principe, sinon on aurait des enlèvements tous les jours, vous comprenez?
Allô?
Ok, c'est bon, je l'ai. C'est un 06 depuis Paris.
Il y a qui là-bas? Personne.
Quoi? Il a jamais été 2 fois dans le même cyber. Faut pas être partout, bordel!
À chaque fois qu'ils te demandent de raccrocher, tu raccroches. Et à chaque fois, c'est Ilan qui souffre un peu plus. Je le sais, ça, je le
Ils
sens.
savent ce qu'ils font.
Non, ils savent pas ce qu'ils font.
Il y a écrit un juif a été enlevé, il n'y a pas écrit un homme a été enlevé. Ils vont le tuer. Je vous assure qu'ils vont le tuer. Il faut les croire, faire tout ce qu'ils disent.
Oui.
Tais-toi. Depuis le début, vous avez compris. Pourquoi vous avez peur de la vérité?
S'il vous plaît, ils vont me tuer. Ne me laissez pas, s'il vous plaît. Maman. Maman, s'il te plaît.
Thank you. Great. Got
All right.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. We just cut it off. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. All right. So, and in that way, I'm really attempting to prime us for conversation during the break. Last night we didn't have the opportunity always. I mean, you're real troopers. You were here for a very long time, and you had traveled. And a nice handful of people actually lingered even longer, and we had a robust conversation. But not everyone had a chance to unpack the 24 days film. So as we go to a break in a short bit, I'm going to invite you to kind of, working from this refresher, begin to think about sharing your own thoughts. But I'll tie this to our syllabus work as well in a final way. And that is, this is one way in which we might use video clips very quickly in a classroom, maybe to anticipate what you want the students to view later, or perhaps afterwards to spark discussion. We could have used this text, this visual text, as a means for our conversation. There's a wonderful quote from the National Council of Teachers of English in which they unpack the meaning of text, which helps us a great deal when we think about literacy in all sorts of disciplines. So often we are conditioned to think of text simply as a written word. And the National Council of Teachers of English help us to think, well, text could be, of course, yes, a written word, but it could be auditory, it could be visual, it could be a walk in the park. Right? So they give us a very expansive definition of text, which opens us up to do the kind of head, heart, hand work that Dewey and other theoreticians talk to us about. But it also gives us an opportunity, particularly in the 21st century, to open up the curriculum in a way which is different from the way we received curricula. One of the things I've learned from being a professional staff developer for over 30 years is that teachers very often teach the way they were taught. And there's great strength in that. But I think we can also be a little bit more cutting edge by, yes, teaching the way that we were taught, but also opening things up to the way that a new generation might learn. And certainly, in Oxford the other day, I saw a woman pushing her daughter in a pram here, a stroller, and the child was fixated. The child didn't look a year old, was fixated on the digital. So, given that, we might move from simply having required reading, recommended reading, to something that I have encouraged at Iscap for the last few years, is that we have RRVLs, that you might have recommended visual and listening as well. So recommended reading, visual, and listening. So this is required reading, required viewing, and required listening. And we have recommended reading, recommended viewing, recommended listening. So RRVLs. Reading, viewing, and listening as a way of bringing them all together with a new way of exploring text. And that might open up the way that we engage the curriculum and the syllabus building that we'll be doing over the next 12 days. So this is just our opening up of all that, and we'll continue on these conversations later. Okay, thank you.